Ben Bellin, and we're going to be talking about Module 4 and financing. So let's get into it here. First off, where can you find the financing? So what are the types of financing you might use to start a business? Okay. First off, we have here the most common, that's going to be personal and family funds. Next, of course, you can always get some money from an investor. You can also take out a loan, such as SBA loans, which we know are kind of the best thing ever. And then finally, a lot of franchisors and vendors will offer some kind of financing for people working for them there. Okay, next, we talked about how great SBA loans are, but what's the step-by-step process to get one? So the first thing you're going to need to do is determine what kind of SBA loan you actually want, right? Because we know, obviously, I'm a sucker for SBA 7A, and a lot of people are, but you also have the SBA 504 and, of course, the microloan. So depending on what you're going for, you're going to want to use a different one. Next thing you're going to want to do is start preparing those documents, and there's a lot of them. So you need all the business documentations, things like tax returns, year-to-date financial statements, profit and loss, balance sheet, cash flow projections, you name it, you need it. So you also want personal documentation as well, such as personal tax returns and credit reports. Next thing you're going to want to do is find a lender. So we know there's a couple different places you can look. You look towards banks. You can look at credit unions. We also heard from some SBA preferred lenders, which we know can help smooth out the process. And then there's other online SBA lenders you can look towards as well. So after you've done all that, you're going to want to apply for one of them. And when you apply, the lender is going to look at a bunch of different things, such as, like we said earlier, credit, your business history, collateral. They'll give you an initial estimate. And then when you're submitting that application, you're also going to want to make sure you have all the other SBA forms, like the Form 1919, which is borrower information, and there's a few others as well in there too. Now, the next step here is underwriting, and this is for the lender. This is what the lender does, and this is where they review all the documents you just gave them, and they determine the level of risk and if there's sufficient collateral for them to take on this loan. And then last step here, we know it's getting funded, so actually getting the money, and that can take a little while as well, so you got to keep that in mind. Okay, next, what do venture capitalists want? What are they looking for in founders and founding teams? Well, we heard from a couple of them, and here's what really came across to me. The number one thing they want is they want a clear vision, and they want direction. What exactly you're going for? Another thing that's super important to them is clear communication. They need to know what you need in the first place. Also, they want people who are coachable, and then they're also going to look at the team. If you're doing this as part of a team, they're going to want to look at the different members of the team and see if they have complementing skill sets. All right, next, what are the pros and cons of getting some money from a VC? Well, obviously, biggest pro here is you're going to get a lot of cash, huge amount of cash, potentially. There's also no repayment, right? No repayment. They're going to provide coaching, and they're also going to have, probably what's the most valuable here is networking and credibility. It's going to add a lot of credibility to your business if it's somebody who's an established VC. Now, there are cons to this, though. The main one is loss of control. If you're going to have no repayment, then you're going to have to give up some control, something to keep in mind. And because you're giving up that control, there's going to be a lot more pressure on you to grow because these venture capitalists are going to want a return on their investment, and you're supposed to provide that to them. All right, next step. How should we approach a venture capitalist? So the first thing you're going to want to do is you're going to research venture capitalists, know kind of what you're looking for, because there's different things you can find, like accelerators I know are out there, but there's also various different types of venture capitalists, and some of them specialize. Next step you're going to do is leverage your network. Look at your pre-existing network and see if you can find some connection to a VC that fits into what you're looking for. They're going to want to reach out to them, schedule a meeting. Now, this is the key part is that pitch. We heard from one of the guest speakers that you really want a 30-second, 1 minute, and 5-minute pitch, and you should have them all ready to go. After you do that pitch, if they're still interested, now you start sending over that documentation. And when you send over all that documentation, such as the finances, you got to be fully transparent, because the most important thing to this process is trust. And speaking of trust, they're not just going to take your word. The venture capitalists are going to do their due diligence. And also for SBA loans, due diligence is going to be done for a lot of different things. Everybody does due diligence. And so the first step for due diligence here is you're going to do a background check. Do you have some kind of criminal history? Have you beaten up your wife in the past 6 months? If so, that's going to be a problem. Next step is they're going to review all your claims. What are you saying you're capable of? You're giving them all these numbers. Are they real? They're going to look into that. The next step there is they're going to start identifying the risks. So potential risks to their investment and your investment, because that's something they need to know before going into this. And then also as part of this process, they're going to examine the things that are critical to your business. So things like your finances. They're going to want to look at, of course, all the legality around your business. They're going to want to look at the market size. What's the potential of this business? Or is it even possible for them to get a return? And then they're also going to want to look into all the members of your team. Even if they're just like employees or contractors, they'll probably want to look into them as well. Okay. However, something to keep in mind is that this is a very important relationship between these investors and the founding team, and it can sour quickly, and there's some things you should and should not be expecting from it. So what you should expect, You should expect a long-lasting relationship. This can go on for 10 plus years. You should expect a lot of support from them, and also be prepared to be regularly updating them. Usually they have a meeting, about once a month or once a quarter. So be prepared for that. Things that can happen that you want to avoid is you want to avoid loss of trust. That's a big one, because once trust breaks down, everything breaks down. You also want to look out for loss of control. If they're being super overbearing, you need to establish those guidelines, which is super important. And so this is part of what we're talking about with dealing with the investor. Dealing with the investor after the investment comes through is you got to lay down those boundaries, because loss of trust, loss of control, that often happens because the boundaries were not laid out. And so up here I have a picture of what you're trying to avoid. I don't know if you've seen the show. It's called Succession. Really good, but basically everything breaks loose. The board meeting is at each other's throats. You don't want that to happen to you. All right, finally, we're going to talk about our guest speakers here, which I enjoyed a lot. So first we heard from these Phoenix investors, and they talked about how industry and management experience is super valuable. Another thing they talked about was the golden ratio. So annualized debt payments. So the annualized debt payments in project, they want like a 1.15 to 1 ratio. So $1.15 has to be made per every dollar is what they're looking for, and they use EBITDA to figure that out. They say the benefits of going with them, they were SBA lenders, is that you get this low down payment and long payment plan. Now, next guest speaker we heard from was all these VC, venture capitalist people, and they were talking about how you need to be looking, you want to look forward to those board meetings. And another thing that really stuck out to me is they talked about how starting a company is a really bad idea on paper, right? Financially, socially, and for your health. So why do you think it's going to work out for you? What advantage do you have? Another thing they said that stuck out to me was that 70% of the people investors work with are referred to them by founders they've previously worked with. So their network is incredibly valuable. Last thing we have here, we heard from this guy who was the owner of Khajiit and somebody who invested in him. And he was talking about how